Good morning. Good morning. I'm Heather Campion, the CEO of the John F. Kennedy Library Foundation, and it's my distinct pleasure to welcome all of you to this national treasure. It's one of only 13 presidential libraries in America and a place where President Kennedy's life and works and ideals come alive. So we hope you'll come back and come back often. On behalf of my colleague Tom Putnam, who's here in the front row, Director of the Kennedy Library, I'd like to thank the generous underwriters of the Kennedy Library Forums, our lead sponsor, Bank of America, Raytheon, the Lowell Institute, the Boston Foundation, and our media partners, the Boston Globe, Xfinity, and WBUR. Today, it's my special privilege to welcome two great Americans to the JFK Library Forum. Our moderator, the buoyant and brilliant E.J. Dionne. Anyone who knows EJ knows that he's proud to have been raised in Fall River, Massachusetts. Yes. But what you may not know is that he went on to Harvard, was a Rhodes Scholar, and in addition to being a journalist, political commentator, and longtime op-ed columnist for the Washington Post, he's written 6 books, including the bestseller, Why Americans Hate Politics. And we are so pleased today to have as our speaker Senator Elizabeth Warren. You know, it's hard to believe that she ran for elective office for the first time and won just 16 months ago. Yeah. And already she needs no introduction. But as we gather here in this monument to President Kennedy, I can't help but note a few qualities that these two public servants, whose time serving Massachusetts in the United States Senate are separated by over half a century, share. Like the president, whose legacy we celebrate every day at this institution, Senator Elizabeth Warren has boundless energy and boundless optimism for our country. She too believes in the power of ideas. And although for most of her life, she never expected or wanted to run for office, she entered politics because she too sees government as an essential force for good. John F. Kennedy believed that by working together, Americans could achieve big and meaningful things. He once said, "I don't believe there is anything this country cannot do." Well, Elizabeth Warren has gone to Washington to do big things for consumers and for working families, and she too has extraordinary confidence in our ability to do big things together. In the last chapter of her book, A Fighting Chance, that we're here to discuss today, she leaves us with a thought that it seems so appropriate to quote at this library. And I'm going to read it. It's on page 276 for those of you who have it. "I believe that it is optimism about the future that sets us apart as a people, this optimism that makes America an exceptional nation. We built this country by striking out on new adventures and propelling ourselves forward on a path we named progress. Along the way, we learned that when we invest in one another, when we build schools and roads and research labs, we build a better future for ourselves and our children and our grandchildren." Please welcome E.J. Dionne and Senator Elizabeth Warren, now a best-selling author.
Thank you. Can I just say I love Heather and Chuck Campion. Can we give Heather a great round of applause? As some of the people here know, including my sister, bless her, is in the front row, I do very much love Fall River. I always say that about 90% of what I believe is explained by growing up in Fall River. And it's appropriate to say here at the Kennedy Library, the turnout slogan in Fall River in every election is "Vote for the Kennedy of your choice, but vote." It's great to be here with Senator Warren, and an honor. And I know people here have certain interests in political questions, but there are characters in this book whom people probably never heard of, and I am referring to Otis, Buddy, and Bonnie. Can you talk about Otis, Buddy, and Bonnie? I'm trying to sell books here because you will see why.
So Otis, Buddy, and Bonnie are dogs. And Otis is our beloved golden retriever who appears throughout the book right up until just before Election Day when Otis died. And so, spoiler alert about the book. But Otis is part of the book because Otis is part of our lives. Buddy and Bonnie have other parts in the book. So when I was a baby professor, I had just gotten my first teaching job. I graduated from law school. I was teaching at the University of Houston. Amelia and Alex are small. I'm trying to run a household and trying to figure out how to teach. I was the second woman hired at the University of Houston. And basically, I was failing at everything. I felt like a terrible mother. Dinner was always late. Every child care arrangement fell apart. I was doing laundry at 11 o'clock at night and trying to get my feet under me about what it meant to be an academic, to teach big law classes, to do research, to do the things I was supposed to be doing. And one night, my Aunt Bee called. And a little backstory, my Aunt Bee is my mother's older sister. She had married very late in life to my Uncle Stanley. Uncle Stanley had passed on by this time, so she was a widow. I'm named after my Aunt Bee, and Aunt Bee had carried me home from the hospital, so I'm very close to my Aunt Bee. So she called. She was living in Oklahoma City. I'm down in Houston. And she said, "So how's it going, honey?" And I just started to cry. And I said, "I'm going to have to quit." And it's like one of those things you don't realize how bad it is until you say it out loud. And then, of course, I just cried harder. And Aunt Bee never said, there, it's all going to be fine. She waited for me to finally wind down and blow my nose and get a drink of water. And then she said, "Well, I can't get there tomorrow, but I can get there Thursday." And she arrived with 7 suitcases and Buddy the Pekingese. And they stayed for 16 years. I say they stayed. That's who Bonnie was. When Buddy passed on to Pekingese heaven, which is separate from the other heaven, Bonnie the Cocker Spaniel lived with us, and along with Aunt Bee. Dogs have been part of our lives all along, and family. I'll say one other thing about that story that you put me in mind of it, because that's part of what this book is about. The story I just told is a story that dates from, what would it be? The late 1970s, early 1980s, right in there, when I first started teaching. Lord, that's a whole generation ago. And even today, young parents who have children still are struggling with childcare, struggling to try to keep the pieces together. This is a problem we should have solved a very long time ago, to make childcare readily available, to make it possible for parents to be able to work and still be able to manage young children. And it's something we have not made enough progress on. It's something that's important to me in the United States Senate. So they all link to policy.
I brought that up for 2 reasons. One is you'll find the book surprisingly personal, as all of this just suggested. The other is you may think of Elizabeth Warren as this idealistic professor, but she knows how to sell books. Oh, yeah. And it gives me an opportunity now. She'll be signing them after here. And somebody in the audience, before we close, please remind me I'm supposed to say that again at the end of the session. I want to stick with the family, if I could, because you begin the book in a very arresting way about your dad having the heart attack, and what it did to your family, and it obviously felt as if you were right at the beginning of the book explaining something about what became your policy obsessions, concerns, passions later on. Could you just talk about that moment a little bit?
Sure. So the book starts when I'm 12 years old, and I was a late-in-life baby, as they used to be called back then, and my mother always called me the surprise. I was about 30 before it occurred to me what that meant. I always thought, surprise. by the time the book opens, my three much older brothers, are all off in the military. So it's my daddy, my mom, and me. My mom was a stay-at-home mom. My daddy was, he sold, by this time, we'd had our, like a lot of families, we'd had our ups and downs. He was selling carpet. And he had a heart attack. And that meant a long period with no money coming in. The bills piled up. We lost the family station wagon. Came about that close to losing our home. And we're really right on the edge of that. The day I walk into my mother's bedroom, she was 50 years old when she pulled her best dress out of the closet, pulled it on, put on her high heels, and walked to the Sears Roebuck to get a minimum wage job to save our house. And for me, the points in there just keep connecting. My mom got a minimum wage job in the 1960s at a time when a minimum wage job would keep a family of 3 afloat. Today, a minimum wage job will not keep a mother and a baby out of poverty. It was a different America, and that's part of the lesson I draw all the way through this. There was no money to send me to college. I went to a commuter college that cost $50 a semester. It opened a million doors for me. Why? Because I grew up in an America that was investing in young people, an America that believed in a middle class, in a strong middle class. But I also grew up with the very hard realism that good people, people who work hard, who play by the rules, can just take an economic punch to the gut. And it's hard to get yourself back and to stabilize and to build something going forward. So you're right, EJ, those twin pieces echo all the way through the book.
In terms of that, I found it interesting how you ended up at George Washington,
Yeah.
and that people talk a lot about, well, how do kids decide where they're going to go to college? This is an interesting story.
So, for openers, there was no money for me to go to college, and besides, my mother didn't want me to go to college. She had sussed this out and said, you need to get married. And it wasn't a joke. I mean, this is just a different time. You need to get married, and you need to marry a good provider. Those were my mother's key word. Good provider, I always thought it was capital G, capital P. And look, I was skinny. I didn't have any particular talents. I was taller than most of the boys. I was not a good prospect, and my mother made that pretty clear. And college was not going to improve my prospects. And I wanted to go to college. I wanted to go to college because I wanted to be a teacher. I so much wanted to be a teacher. And you can't do that if you don't go to college. So what I figured out, I was a high school debater. And I got a book at the counselor's office and read through every college. It had 1 page per college. I have no idea what this book, in retrospect, what it must have been, but 1 page per college. And I read through, and I found 2 colleges that mentioned debate scholarships. And one was Northwestern in Evanston, Illinois, and one was George Washington University in Washington, D.C. And so I saved up my babysitting money. I bought a money order for each college to cover the application fee, and applied to both colleges without telling my parents. I was a girl with a plan, and my plan was if I could get in and get a full scholarship, who could complain? I could go to college, it wouldn't cost anything, I'd be fully covered. I then found out I had to have my parents' I had to have their tax statement because I had to sign a financial disclosure. This had not been part of my plan. So I had to tell my parents that I had applied for college, and my mother was not happy with me. But my daddy said, let her try. And I still remember the day the 2 returns came, one from Northwestern and one from GW. I gotten into both, yay. But the first thing I looked at is how much money. And GW gave me more money, and that's where I went to college. But the story doesn't have quite the ending you would expect. At 19, Jim Warren, first boy I'd ever dated, first boy who'd ever dumped me. I dated him when I was 13. Jim dropped back into my life. He'd graduated from college. He was ready for a wife. I looked good. He proposed. He was a good provider, and it took me about a nanosecond to say yes. So I actually dropped out of college, gave up my scholarship, and stayed home for 30 minutes before I said, I still got to go to college. And that's how I ended up in a commuter college. It's also about second chances in America. Yeah.
By the way, Senator Warren reveals her addictions in this book. One of them is to Mounds bars, which
Yes.
I realize risks the opposition from the anti-coconut people, but we will. Life is full of accidents, and one of the accidents that struck me in the book is that what became your passion for bankruptcy law came out of a teaching job,
Yeah.
where you volunteered to teach a course on bankruptcy. Talk about that, because it obviously led down a path that you would never have anticipated when you started
Yes.
teaching that class.
So I taught, once I ended up in law school, I started out teaching, I taught special needs kids. Then I had a baby, I go to law school, and I end up teaching in law school, and I teach money. I am very interested in money. No, this is serious. I'd seen what it's like not to have it. And I wanted to understand how it worked, what the pieces were, how finance worked, how contracts worked. So I was teaching these courses. Bankruptcy is the toughest, one of the toughest, I should say, courses in law school. It's complicated, it's got this very complicated statute, it's got a lot of finance in it, got a lot of math in it. It's a tough course. It is also a course about economic death, and as I came to learn, it's a course about economic rebirth. And so I volunteered to teach the bankruptcy course, my third year in teaching, I think it was, at the University of Texas. And as they say, the rest is history.
Well, take it from there. I mean, you started doing a lot of research on bankruptcies. There was a moment when you had that confrontation, or I don't know if exactly it was a confrontation, with that expert on
Yes.
bankruptcy law who didn't seem to know exactly why people went bankrupt. And it led to a certain amount of research.
So for any of you who didn't go to law school back then, because law schools, I think, have changed in some substantial ways. Law school is about theory, right? It's about deductive logic. It's about you start with principles and you deduce, what the world should look like and how we should work on it. And so we had a new bankruptcy law in America at the time that I'm teaching, and there are no case books yet to be able to teach from. You can teach the old bankruptcy law out of the old case books, but the new case books haven't come through yet for the new bankruptcy law. So I had taught this course for weeks, and I taught it, I don't know how else to teach it, I taught it like a Jeopardy class. That is, if this was the answer, the piece you'd read in the statute, what do you think the question was? What was the problem that Congress was trying to solve if this is how they ended up writing law? What must be going on out there? So it turns out, while I'm in the middle of teaching this course, a very famous expert came to class. Well, he came to visit at the university where I was, and he was straight out of central casting. He had this wonderful, he's little and a little bent over, and he had this wonderful German accent and these tufts of white hair, and he was brilliant. He spoke like 185 languages and, had written more books than most libraries had. I mean, he's just a well-renowned expert. So he comes to visit my class, and I got my class all primed about, we are going to be able to hear from the man who was there when Congress was writing this bankruptcy law a few years ago. And he will be able to tell us, all secrets will be revealed here, okay? Boy, that's an intro, right? So he comes in and he starts revealing secrets, and he tells these great things, wonderful professor. And he tells a few things, and we got to the question about personal bankruptcy. We've been talking about Chapter 11, it's business bankruptcy. Get to the question about personal bankruptcy. And we asked about a particular provision in the code. A student did. I was letting my students ask questions. And he said, well, he said, we know who goes bankrupt. You know, they are maids and day laborers, people at the economic edges of society. And I looked over with this great look of anticipation, and I said, and how do we know that? And he said, because we know. And I said, well, yeah, but how do we know this? And I pushed him on it, and it was very interesting. I totally missed the barb when he said, well, all experts know, and kind of shot me back a look on this, you know, because I clearly was not. But what emerged in this conversation was that Congress had written a large and complicated bankruptcy law that would affect hundreds of thousands of people a year who were in serious financial trouble without any good data or understanding about what was actually happening to cause people to go broke, who is going broke, what bankruptcy could do for them to help them get back on their feet. It was all just kind of theoretical. And I will say, I was genuinely shocked in this, having this visitor in my classroom, the guy who was supposed to know everything. It was a little like the Wizard of Oz moment when you say, but I thought you knew all this. And it turned out he didn't. And the consequence of that was I thought, you know, I'm going to go find out. And so I met with another baby professor, only she wasn't in law. She was in sociology, somebody who knows how to go out and gather data. And we teamed up with a third person who was a law professor who's been in practice for a while, and built a study to go look at people who were in bankruptcy and to get some basic information about who they were, what had gone wrong in their lives, and how it intersected with the law. And this was at a time in law schools when this just didn't happen much. So this put me in bankruptcy courthouses around America, expecting to meet people who were different. My family didn't file for bankruptcy. We had some tough times, but we never had to file for bankruptcy. And I was sure, or at least hoped, I was going to see all those people and they were going to be so different. And the truth was, they weren't different at all. They look like us. They look like our neighbors, our brothers and our sisters, our cousins. And that's when the world began to change for me. It began to change in the sense that I started to look harder at what's happening to America's middle class. And this is the front edge, if you, as I eventually did, look at the data over time, of starting to see the pieces break apart for what was happening to America's middle class. It starts with flat wages. It goes to rising healthcare costs, rising housing costs, rising costs of getting a kid educated, and how the middle class starts coming under a squeeze. Bankruptcy is the tail end of that. Most families still don't end up there. But it was the way to understand in the most extreme form the kind of pressure that was building on America's middle class, and it shaped my work for the rest of my life.
I was struck that you did these studies and people were explaining why they went bankrupt, and you remarked that there's a lot of self-loathing. And there was one respondent who just wrote the words about himself, why he went bankrupt: stupid, stupid, stupid. And it was a very striking moment in there. And obviously it led you to where you went. And so I want to jump ahead to stick with bankruptcy. Congress changed the law to make it harder for people to declare bankruptcy, and you fought at the time. I think that's the first time I ever talked to you, was you fought tooth and nail against that. Why did so many Democrats go south on the bankruptcy bill?
God, it was awful. Let me just say.
Just to explain my question, a lot of Democrats who, in the eyes of Senator Warren, in the eyes of Ted Kennedy at the time, by the way, felt this bill was an outrage because it would make it really difficult for people who had legitimate medical bankruptcies, for example, it would really put them in a hole. And yet the bill passed with an overwhelming majority. So that's what when I say go south, I'm expressing a value judgment, I confess. Go ahead.
Yeah. Well, but this is the first fight in the book. I first start the personal story and then move to what I call the bankruptcy wars, because they lasted for 10 years. For 10 years. But this is where I was the eyewitness to what's broken in Washington. That basically the whole idea behind this law was a half a dozen credit card companies who were drawing in hundreds of millions of dollars in revenues and then in profits. And what they wanted is they figured out they were making money hand over fist. I mean, there's just no other way to describe this. They were borrowing low and lending high, and you could afford to take on a lot of people who had bad debts, to spend a lot of money on advertising and still take home incredible amounts of money. That was the business model. So what they figured out is where they were the sweet spot and where they were making money were people who were in financial trouble. They weren't making money off people who can afford to pay their bills in full every month. They were making money off people who stumbled a little and then kind of would right themselves, and then would stumble a little more and right themselves. People who at a time when the banks could borrow the money for 4% were lending it out at 36%, and then fees on top of that were pushing the effective rates beyond that. So they look at their spreadsheets, their business model, and they say, but every year we have to write off some number of tens of millions of dollars for people who ultimately just collapse into bankruptcy. Now, they've already made plenty of money, and plenty of money actually usually off those people from the years that the people kept paying and paying and paying. But they figured out, if you could keep them out of bankruptcy, if you keep half of them out of bankruptcy, if you could get them to delay bankruptcy by 6 months and stumble and pay a little bit more, you get a little bit more money. Who knows? Maybe somebody will sell her wedding ring. Maybe somebody will go ahead and sell the family car. Maybe they'll borrow from grandma and ask for additional money. Other ways that they can shovel more money into the credit card companies. So the credit card companies came to Washington to change this law, and I thought, you gotta be kidding me. In a democracy, a handful of large financial institutions could never get a law changed that would hammer hundreds of thousands of middle-class families every year. You just couldn't get something like that passed. Well, when you've got an army of lobbyists on one side and people who have no lobbyists, have no voice, who don't want to stand up and identify themselves as people who file for bankruptcy, who don't want to picket, who don't want to organize, who do not want to be part of a group to say, yeah, I file for bankruptcy. No, they saw themselves as stupid, 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 and didn't want to be part of this. And what happens? Man, that bill was like it was on greased skids. It was going and it was going to pass. It had all the Republicans and a big chunk of Democrats behind it.
So why did the Democrats go?
Come on. I just described it. The lobbyists, the campaign contributions, the lawyers, they were all on one side. All on one side. And that becomes the first fight in the book. And this is what I'll say. 10 years I fought that fight. I fought that fight in Washington, and at the end of 10 years, I lost. I didn't lose, American families lost. The banks got exactly what they wanted, but I'll tell you this. I was never the same. I came out of that fight tougher and more determined and smarter than I had been going into it. For me, this becomes the opening place in the fight. It's where you make the decision. Are we really going to be a country that says we're just going to hand it over? And if you can get together enough lobbyists, if you can get together enough lawyers, if you can put enough money into the political process, then you get to write the rules. You get to write the rules that help the rich and the powerful. Or are we going to be a country that says, no, this country belongs to the people, and we're going to take it back from those who do the lobbying?
All right, I was going to ask this later, but that sounded like, oh, I don't know, a presidential candidate talking. So why don't you, so if you want to fight so much, why aren't you running for president?
EJ, what you have to see in this is not about campaigns. This is my life's work, but this has to be America's work right now. I mean, we have reached this moment where those with money and power just increasingly are calling the shots. I mean, look at what I was talking about. What I was talking about was before Citizens United. The first fights are before we had words like super PACs and the anonymous ads. And what's happened since then? It has gotten worse, or as I would describe it, the problem has gotten more urgent. So for me, it's about sticking to the issues. This is what we have to talk about, and that's what I'm going to keep talking about.
Do you think that the party has been changing on these issues since, say, that bankruptcy fight? Do you notice, because obviously we got to get to the economic downturn and a bunch of other things I'd like to get to, what do you think is happening in the party on these questions of fairness, justice, inequality?
Well, you know, we've always had good people in the Democratic Party on this issue. And there was a long time, I want to be clear, it depends on what your long arc of history is. There was a long time when Democrats and Republicans looked at laws in terms of, does it help build America's middle class? I mean, this is coming out of the Great Depression. I'm not saying there weren't people, you know, at the edges who weren't, but that was the central question. That's how you end up with things like a GI Bill, an FHA, and a national highway system, and building power grids, and making all those investments in NIH and NSF. We were in America that said, we're going to do better together. We were in America that believed in strong labor laws, and we wanted to see labor unions get stronger because we saw as we lifted workers, then we lifted America. And you know, it worked. It worked. We were a country where as our families got richer, our country got richer. As our country got richer, our families got richer. And then it shifted. And it shifted starting in the 1980s. And it shifted with a different message. And the message was, first message was, fire the cops. That's how I think of it. It was described as deregulation, but it was fire the cops, not the cops on Main Street, the cops in the regulatory agencies. Push them down, deregulate, give them less, make them become more customer friendly. You've heard that phrase, right? Excuse me, they don't work for the industries they regulate. They're supposed to be working for the American people. But that got really pushed out to the edge. The other half of it was more money for those at the top. Put in tax breaks that leave more wealth at the top. And another way to say those two things together, the rich get richer and the powerful get more powerful. And how are we going to pay for that? Pay for it by cutting back on all those other investments that we had been making in a country, on education, on infrastructure, on basic research. Push down on workers' rights. Make this a country that works for those at the top, not so much for everybody else. And that's been the tilt in the system. And I think what's happening now is a lot of folks on the Democratic side have begun to say, wait a minute, that idea that, you know, remember the one that Ronald Reagan put forward? What are I never remember the exact number, 9 worst words in the English language. Do you remember that one? I'm from the government and I'm here to help you.
The 3 biggest lies.
Yes, his was always, the worst sentence in the English language is, I'm from the government and I'm here to help you. No, it's not. I can think of a lot of worse sentences than that. In fact, one of them would be, I'm from the government and I just don't care about you. I'm from the government and I'm here to help the guys who already have plenty of money and plenty of power. And so I think there's a real rethinking now on the progressive side about what is the role of government? What does government do for us? How do we combine through government both to solve our problems and to build a future? And so I think that's where we're seeing movement. That's how I see it.
One of the things that struck me from what you said in the book is that there is a sense in which you are like Ronald Reagan in an odd way. Reagan came along, they see, now she'll walk out. But Reagan came along at a time when conservatives or liberalism had been so powerful for so long that conservatives were almost embarrassed about making their arguments. And Reagan said, no, you don't have to be embarrassed. And he made a series of simple, straightforward arguments. And I read you as I read you here and in a lot of other places saying, wait a minute, this progressive tradition is something we don't have to apologize for. And I want to go to a place in the book that really struck me. It was when you were fighting for, again, fighting for the Consumer Financial Protection Bureau. And you visit with Congressman Michael Grimm, former FBI agent, former military vet, graduate of Public University. And I quote here, when I launched into an enthusiastic description of what we were trying to get done at the agency, the congressman looked surprised. After a bit, he cut me off so he could make one thing clear. He didn't believe in government. And then,
that's what he said.
Paragraph, two sentences. I thought I'd misunderstood him. What? Question mark. And then you talk about how it was odd given his background, but then you ask a series of questions. Would you rather fly in an airplane without the FAA checking air traffic control? Would you rather swallow a pill without the Food and Drug Administration testing drug safety? I want you to address this sense again that I have, that you're really saying stop apologizing, stop being reluctant to say things that lots of progressives have always believed, but somehow we're so concerned about sounding pro-market that they wouldn't say them anymore.
Yeah, so you're right about this, EJ. I don't think we have anything to apologize for. In fact, I think we have a lot to be proud of. Government is what we do together. And the way I see this is government has three functions. One is the national defense. We all get that. The second is to put a cop on the beat, to make sure nobody steals your purse on Main Street, nobody steals your pension on Wall Street, right? That's the basic idea. And the third is to help us make the investments together that none of us can make alone. Nobody can pave the road in front of her house and hope her neighbors will do the same, and therefore we will have a transportation system that works. So those are the investments we make together. And I talk about the key ones. Education, we educate all of our children, partly so they will have opportunities, and partly because well-educated children will produce a lot and help us be a richer country. It's true. Yes, we invest in infrastructure. Why? Because we don't know what the next startup business is, the next great innovation is, but we're pretty sure you're going to need to plug in. We're pretty sure you're going to need to travel on roads to get your goods to market. We're pretty sure you're going to need the basic infrastructure so you can do the part that you do that's extraordinary, that goes beyond that. And the third one, because this is what makes us an extraordinary people. We have, for 3/4 of a century now, invested in research on the idea, think about that, medical research, scientific research, engineering research, all kinds of research. As a people, we put a little in the kitty to say put it into research because we believed that if we built a big pipeline of ideas, that our kids would do things with that we could only dream of. That's how we built a future as a country. Those are the things we do through government. Government is the part that helps us together build the opportunities so that the next kid can make it big, and the kid after that, and the kid after that. You got to get out there and do that part on your own, but you start from a foundation that all of us invested in, and a strong foundation gives us a strong country. That's what progressives are about.
let me throw at you the criticism that you talk about some in the book, that a lot of, including some Democratic business guys, say, she's a professor, and bear in mind, in American politics, professor is the most vicious attack you can level against someone.
Let the mudslinging begin.
Yeah, it's an old Daniel Patrick Moynihan line.
That's right.
Who doesn't like capitalism, doesn't like business, doesn't believe in this fundamental economic system that made us rich. And I asked you this once, and I was surprised by how strong a defense of capitalism you made. And I wanted to sort of tease you out on sort of how does this view of government's role fit with a view of the market economy?
So I love capitalism. I love markets. I think markets really are terrific at what they do. They are fabulous at producing goods and services, at giving people who've got some gumption, who've got a good idea, who are willing to work longer or harder than other people, real opportunities when markets are level, when they're honest markets. So, for example, the role of the FDA. Think about drugs. Everybody in here takes aspirin, never worries about what's in it, right? It's aspirin. It's not baking soda, which won't do you any good. It doesn't have rat poop in it. Okay, sorry about that, but those are things you'd have to worry about if you didn't have an FDA that makes sure that the drugs are safe, that they're properly labeled, that they are what they are. So, what's the role of the FDA? Keep that market honest. Don't have companies out there competing on their aspirin products by lowering the cost by sticking in something that's cheap or by not being clean and scrubbing their machines. The part a consumer can't see, the government watches out for. The safety, the government watches out for. Then knock yourself out on competing. That you've got baby aspirin and flavored aspirin and aspirin that's covered with coatings so your tummy won't hurt when you take it, and aspirin in gummy bear shapes so that little kids will want to chew it at the right time, and aspirin with easy lids and tough lids. Knock yourself out on that. That's how markets are supposed to work, and that is how that market has worked. The role of government is to make sure that honest competitors in the market won't be undercut by the cheaters. The role of government is to reassure the consumer. You can go into that market and know that when it says you're buying aspirin, you're really getting aspirin. Government is what keeps capitalism working. That's how it works. Yep.
As you can probably tell, Senator Warren isn't very ambiguous on many questions. There is one ambiguity I felt in the book, and maybe the professor will tell me I missed something, which is I couldn't tell how you would have voted on the bailout, the bank bailout, because you talk in the book about what we could have spent that money on. You list all the things, how many people we could educate and all the like. As you know, Secretary Geithner his book is coming out. I think I'd love to see a debate, actually, or a conversation between you and Secretary Geithner. But he makes, and I have to say what I think is a decent case on the narrow question of where would the economy have been if the government hadn't stepped in and prevented the collapse of these financial institutions. And he argues, as you know, that we didn't do it to say, there was actually collateral benefit. It's an interesting concept that people who actually did cheat and did make a lot of money, some of them did get protected by this. Nonetheless, if these banks and financial institutions had gone down, the unemployment, the suffering among average people would have been extraordinary. And President Obama supported the bailout when he was in the Senate. How would you have voted, and what is your attitude toward that particular moment?
So, I tried to lay this out in the chapter, but evidently not entirely successfully. If I wasn't clear about this,
or at least not. Didn't get through my.
No. But I want to make the point because there are really 2 points that have to move here. The question of whether or not the United States government should have acted as we were hurtling over a cliff. The answer is of course. There's no doubt about that. Yes. To stand on principle and say you guys lied and cheated, and therefore we're going to let the whole economy go back to the Stone Age, that's not going to work. It's not going to work for us. It's not going to work for anybody but. and here's the key to it. The question was how the money was then spent. So the bailout, look, this is how the pieces fit together. I come from a background of bankruptcy. I know what it means to put new capital into a failing business. In fact, we actually watched it happen with the auto industry. What happens when you put new capital in, either in bankruptcy or just because you're the new investor in a troubled company? And the answer is you wipe out the shareholders, the existing debt takes a haircut, the CEOs get fired, and the company has to come up with a new business plan that says, we're not following that old model that was the model that got us here. We have plans to follow a new one, and here's how you can tell we're going to do something different. Those are the keys. And my view is, and if you are using public money, there's one more part, and that is, what is your obligation to help during this crisis? What happened when the Treasury Department, and this happened under both administrations, and I'm equally willing to hammer on them about it. When the largest financial institutions started to stumble, they said to those financial institutions, take our money, please. And when they put no restrictions on it, no pain associated with taking it, no limitations, you can put that money in your vault and just build up your balance sheet, as some did. You can use that money to go acquire other financial institutions, and that's what some of them did. You can just hold on to that money while you continue to foreclose against hundreds of thousands of families that you cheated. That's when the mistake was made, because that is the moment that Too Big to Fail was created. The idea that not only is the money there, the money is there in a way that lets CEOs continue to hold that fancy office, continue to pull down big bonuses, that lets everybody get rich again on the other side who gets bailed out. That's where the mistake was made, and that's the part we're still paying for today.
There were moments in the book when I wanted to see the outtakes, and what I am particularly I am particularly talking about is your account of a rather complicated relationship with the Obama administration on some of these issues, but also in particular on the Consumer Financial Protection Bureau, where on the one hand, the president did name you to set it up, but he wouldn't name you to run it, didn't think you could get through the Senate. And there was a lot of back and forth with the president, and you were elected to office, you are a politician, and you're quite respectful to the president. Nonetheless, I wonder, I'm probably going to get nowhere with this question, but could you elaborate a bit on that complexity, and on that relationship? Because there's a lot there in the book, but I just read it and felt like, boy, there's a lot there I wish I knew. That's why we have investigative reporters, by the way.
So, look, I'm going to back it up just a little bit in time, but I'll stay with the same subject. I want to be really clear about this. Just for those of you who don't know about it, the Consumer Financial Protection Bureau, the basic idea is that we needed an agency in Washington, one that would make sure that the large financial institutions didn't build their profit models around cheating people. Kind of straightforward. And surprise, surprise, there were a lot of laws on that, but no agency who was really watching out to make sure that those were enforced. So I had this idea for the Consumer Financial Protection Bureau. We're in the time of the financial crisis. They're starting to write what become the financial regulations, Dodd-Frank. I want to put in one plug about the fight again. And I put in the idea for this Consumer Financial Protection Bureau, and lots of groups help out on this. Lots and lots of groups help out. The banks were spending more than $1 million a day for more than a year to fight off financial regulation. In fact, think of it. While they were getting your money to be bailed out while your money was sitting in their vaults, they were taking money to go lobby Congress to weaken the financial regulations. We got the Consumer Financial Protection Bureau because Barack Obama was in the White House. He stood up and fought for it. And he stood up and fought for it at a time when not only were all of the Republicans opposed to it, there was some Democratic opposition as well. No one wanted to be public about it. His own advisors, I think there were some who were willing to throw it under the bus in return for some other things they would have liked to have seen in Dodd-Frank. The president stood up strong for the Consumer Financial Protection Bureau. And I also want to make clear, when the president didn't nominate me, sure, I was disappointed. And there's no ambiguity about that in the book. In fact, I think the words are there, I was disappointed. Yeah, I wanted to do it. Are you kidding? This looked like fun. I figured out how this was going to work. But the Republicans had already sent a letter over saying, 41 Republicans had said, no, we are not going to approve ahead of the Consumer Financial Protection Bureau. They wanted certain things. I felt like the first woman in history. Remember the pre-approved credit cards? I had fought them on pre-approved credit. I was a pre-rejected nominee. The Republicans sent a letter over to the president saying, just in case you're thinking of nominating somebody, let us tell you, we have a blocking position now. And I have no doubt that the president wanted to give that agency a strong start. And ultimately, he appointed someone, Rich Cordray, whom I had hired, who's terrific. He was the former Attorney General of Ohio, and I had hired him as head of enforcement. Rich is the one who's setting up the agency. And as we say, it's tough to be unhappy about this now because, after all, I did end up with the great honor of representing the people of the Commonwealth of Massachusetts. No. But here's the fun part. And sitting on the banking committee, which has jurisdiction over the little Consumer Financial Protection Bureau.
Which led me to my next question, which is, has any Republican ever come up to you and said, boy, I wish we had given you that consumer agency and we could have kept you out of the Senate?
No, but plenty have said,
how much time do we have left? 5 minutes? I have a ton of questions here. I apologize. Let me just ask one question about the Senate, and if I can do just two quick, I'll read you several from the audience, including, Massachusetts, I say this as a Fall River guy, are known not always to be hospitable to outsiders. We have our own ways of doing politics. Mary McGrory, the late great Mary McGrory, said every baby born in Massachusetts is born with a campaign manager's gene. Whatever gave you the idea of somebody from Oklahoma and Harvard could get elected to the Senate for Massachusetts? What was that like at the beginning, dealing with this state, this party? How did that work?
You know, I lived here for 20 years by the time I ran for office.
Newcomer, we say, in Massachusetts.
But at the end of the day, I guess I felt like that wasn't what mattered to anybody. This was about, the way I saw the race, this was about who did you want to have in Washington fighting for you. And look, whatever else you want to say, I was running against a guy who had been named one of Wall Street's favorite congressmen. And I got out and just talked to people, and said, this is my life's work. This is what I believe is happening in Washington. This is what I'll fight for. And people said, we're with you all the way. I guess the way to say it is, in the race, I never felt like an outsider. I felt like this was about people. This was about us.
I was just handed a piece of paper here, a blue Altima plate 744. It's about to be foreclosed. No, I don't know what the problem is with the Altima, but if that's your car, ask somebody about it so you don't get into trouble on it. Let me just throw several of the questions at you that are here, and you can sort of answer them as you will.
I'll take consumer finance for $200, DJ.
Okay. When will, I should try to do it Jeopardy style, but
That's
anyway,
right.
when will a banker or other financial persons go to trial for doing so much damage to us in the middle class? That's one question. What are you going to do about the UPS pre-funding bill with saving the post office? And what do you make of a carbon tax that's revenue neutral? And this is important. We love you, Elizabeth. Today is my mom's 84th birthday. Could you wish Dorothy Hayes a happy birthday?
Oh, Dorothy, where are you? Dorothy? Dorothy, happy birthday. Happy birthday. Boy, that was easy. Okay, so actually...
The bankers, the carbon tax, and the post office.
And the post office. Okay, because I talk about these forever. I'd sound like a college professor. How did that happen? Okay, so the bankers. The answer is probably not. Probably not, because we are now hitting statute of limitations, length of time, but probably not because we never put any energy behind this. I just want to remind people that in the savings and loan crisis, you remember the savings and loan crisis, late 70s, early 1980s, when a bunch of savings and loans got into financial shenanigans? More than 800 people went to jail. More than 1,000 people were prosecuted under it. Why? Because the basic presumption of our regulators was, you know, if your book said you had this on one day, and the very next day you had this, we just want to make sure there was nothing going on here that sounds a little hinky on this. I think the fact that there was such limited investigation and such limp enforcement of the laws following the financial crisis has had a profound effect on this country. And it's in both places. In the financial institutions, boy, those guys have not trimmed their sails. The 5 largest financial institutions in this country today are 38% bigger than they were in 2008 when they were too big to fail. Think about that. These guys still swagger through Washington. They block legislation they don't like. They try to roll over the regulatory agencies. And to this day, when someone breaks the law, and I'll just give you criminal, laundering drug money, violating our sanctions against other countries, nobody gets arrested, nobody goes to trial, nobody goes to jail. So the consequences of not holding large financial firms accountable, and more to the point, individuals within them accountable, I think is still being felt in the financial system, and it worries me where we're headed on that. The second part is what it's done to everyone else. The profound feeling that, boy, the game really is tilted. That a kid gets caught with a couple of ounces of marijuana and sure as heck gets arrested, gets prosecuted, and could end up in jail, but not a banker who laundered millions of dollars in drug money. What happened to the idea that we're in America where everybody is equal under the law, where everybody faces the same kind of accountability? An America where we're not perfect, but we're an America that believes fundamentally in equality and fairness. I think that one of the real prices of the 2008 financial crisis and the response to it has been to take a lot of that away from us. And I think there's a real cost to that, a real cost to that.
Have I gone past our time? I just don't want to, or do you want to just take a shot at the post office?
I'd love to take a shot at the post office.
Yeah.
Let me take a quick shot at the post office, because this really does fit into, boy, the piece is about, let's prove that government can't work. What's the best way to prove that government can't work? Well, here's one. most Americans think the post office kind of does what it's supposed to do. And particularly people in rural areas who count on those postal deliveries, they know that they're there. People who are in inner cities who can go to the post office, these are safe places, these are reliable places. They do their job. But we hear over and over and over and over and over and over and over, oh, it's losing money, it's just a business catastrophe. You know what, one of the biggest pieces of that is not everything that's going on. Look, they got to make adjustments. You know, emails changed how we do a lot of things. But one of the biggest parts is that the federal government, a Republican Congress signed into law by a Republican president, requires that the post office, unlike every other agency in government, has to pre-fund billions of dollars of pension liability. So it's an accounting entry that says we're going to take out of the post office revenues this big hunk of money that are not taken out of other agency revenues, and then say, lo and behold, the post office is in terrible financial trouble. To me, this goes to a point I didn't get to make, and I didn't get to make in the book, but I really want to say this. Government is not perfect. Oh, Lord, we can look around and see where there are mistakes, where there is waste, where there's folly, where there are errors. But what should our response be? Our response should not be, well, then let's shut it down. Let's close it down. Let's starve it off. Let's make it so that nobody wants to go work there. Let's make government even worse. That's not the response. When our government fails, our response has to be, we have to make it better. We must make it better. That's our job. I sit in that banking committee, and one of the things the banking committee in the United States Senate has is oversight over the financial regulators. We got a lot of law out there. If you say to the financial regulators, we're going to hold you accountable for enforcing those laws, you start to move this big battleship. That's what we have to do as a people. We have to hold our government accountable. There are many things government can't do. We do better individually, we do better within our families, we do better on our own. But the things we need government for, there's no replacement. So we've got to use government to help us solve the problems, to make those investments in research, to make those investments in infrastructure, to make those investments in education, because it is with those investments we make together that we really are going to build a future again for our children. We're going to rebuild America's middle class. That's it.
I could go on like this for a couple hours, but then I should have tried to take an Elizabeth Warren course some time ago. I just want to close. One of my favorite passages in the book is actually an odd passage to have as your favorite. Before I forget, Senator Warren has said how much she believes in capitalism. There will be books available at the end of the session. But one of the passages I liked is when your staff at the Consumer Protection Bureau was trying to write an understandable one-page mortgage, and not a document that was, 150 pages long. Lawyers barely understand them, but something that said everything that was in the mortgage. And finally, there was a focus group, and it seemed to work, the one they got. And you'll see why I like this passage. So she's very excited, and she says, okay, it wasn't exactly the Red Sox winning the World Series, and there was still a whole lot of work to do before this form and others would be final and lenders would be required to use them, but we thought it was pretty exciting. Two things about that. She really is a policy wonk, and she really now is truly from Massachusetts and probably even knows how to spell Pedroia. Thank you very much, Elizabeth Warren.
Thank you. Thank you. Thank you, EJ. Thank you. 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 Thanks, EJ.
Oh, thank you.
Thank you again. Thank you.